Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here for our first virtual long walk presentation of the academic year. Before we jump in, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Michelle DeLuce. I'm Associate Director of Alumni Relations at Trinity, and I'm here to share a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into the exciting part of the evening. I just wanted to share with you that you'll notice the chat function for our Zoom this evening is turned off, and that is to better allow us to keep an eye on all of the questions that we're expecting to get. The Q&A function is on, so if you need to contact me for any reason because you need help with the technology, you can use the Q&A function for that, but that's also how you can submit your questions to the panelists. I do want to note that we received over 100 questions in advance of this session. So we know there's a lot of ground to cover. Our panelists are going to do the best they can to address as many of your questions as possible. But just to be aware, with that many questions on everyone's mind, we know there will be some we don't get to, and that is unfortunate, but we'll cover as much ground as we can in the hour that we have. With that said, without further ado, I am going to hand things over to Bill Marimow, who is going to be our guide for the evening.
All right, Michelle, thank you. And for all of those out there, welcome to our program. The four of us did this panel back in June to a very receptive audience at the alumni weekend. And to say the least, a lot has changed in the last 4 months. All you have to do is look at today's headlines between Israel, the Ukraine, Hurricane Helene, and the presidential race. And this panel is entitled Dissecting Today's News, How to Detect and Debunk Fake News. For the layman, it's just distinguishing between fact and utter poppycock. The way we're going to work it tonight is I'm going to introduce our panelists. Each of them will have brief opening remarks. Then we'll spend a few minutes discussing what we've said. And by 7:30, 7:35, we're going to turn it over to you because ultimately we're not mind readers. We want to talk about what interests you the most. And hopefully an hour after the panel ends at 9 o'clock, you can take your newfound insights and apply them to the debate between our two vice presidential candidates, Tim Walz and J.D. Vance, who will be sparring at 9 o'clock. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. First is Ellen Weiss. I got to know Ellen when she was the national editor of National Public Radio, which I joined in 2006. Ellen was a great mentor to me, learning the skills of broadcasting, and she has amassed 4 Peabody Awards in her career. Today, Ellen oversees a mother-son podcast production company. They call it Rock Creek Sound, and the reason they have that title is because Ellen is a trail maintainer in Rock Creek Park in Washington, and she spends many weekends hauling dirt and moving rocks. Like me and Vernon, Ellen is a member of the board of the Fund for Investigative Journalism. Vernon Loeb, to Ellen's right on the screen or left on the screen, was a colleague of mine at the Philadelphia Inquirer, where he was a stellar reporter and later a stellar editor. Vernon also was a reporter and writer at the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Atlantic. Today, he's the editor of Inside Climate News and a stellar editor. Vernon has run 68 marathons, and he is still in perpetual motion. Which brings me to John Levy. John is an astute business leader, an investor, and an astute assessor of political acumen and political leadership potential. Like me, he was a member of the Trinity class of 1969. He went on to become the president of Wob and Company, which was a Fortune 500 company. But most importantly, John has been my friend for almost 60 years, ever since that day in September 1965, when I helped him carry his stereo system up 4 flights of stairs at Elton Hall. With that, we're going to turn things over to Ellen for a very brief introductory remark or two.
Thank you, Bill. Bill, you have been a mentor of mine, but I know I'm going to use my 3 minutes wisely.
You'd better.
I wanted to share one story from the news because I think even for me, it sort of captures how fast things change in terms of what a fact means and what even fact-checking means. So, and this will sound familiar if anyone's been following what's been happening in Springfield, Ohio, but I want to take you back to August at an event where Trump claimed that schools were sending children for gender-affirming surgery without their parents' knowledge. And he literally said, the transgender thing is incredible. Think of it. Your kid goes to school and comes home a few days later with an operation. The school decides what's going to happen with your child. Now, almost immediately, the Trump campaign said they could not find a single example of such a thing happening anywhere in the United States. They agreed that parent consent would be necessary. Even after that, Trump went on to repeat this over and over again. But what really, I think, scares even someone like me is that when news sources reached out to conservative groups, they also agreed they couldn't substantiate one thing, but it didn't matter. Because, to quote some of them, are kids getting surgery in school? No, of course not. But one, this is a representative of one group, said, I'm still so thankful to President Trump for making that claim, since she said his remark has drawn attention to an important issue, right? It grabbed your attention, we're talking about it. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. Someone else from the Heritage Foundation said the same thing. The Trump point is completely valid, given how some schools are not notifying parents about their children's social transitions. Even though they're not aware of a single incident where it's gone this far, if you just change a couple of words in Trump's quote and make it about a child coming home from school with new gender identity rather than coming home from school with an operation, then the claim is 100% accurate and correct. Of course, the problem is we don't fact check hypothetical alternative quotes, right? But as we know now from Springfield, Ohio, from the vice presidential candidate, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, right? It's useful. It makes the point. And I think even for me, as I've seen my whole career, 40 years, how the truth gets stretched, how people say things that are false, the fact that there's a defense of false claims on behalf of making a larger point, even when people know that they're false, to me, I don't know, somehow it just stepped over a line. And I guess that's really all I want to say, Bill.
All right, Ellen, thank you. We're going to move now to John Levy, please, and then Vernon and myself.
Good evening. So when we first met some time ago, and the subject was detecting fake news, I offered that that really wasn't what I was prepared to address. And so I think I'll stay with that a little bit, although Ellen's certainly given me an opportunity in. And so I think of the topic, and I think of one of the publications we said, the question really is, what's the landscape of journalism? And so I start with a premise that all of us in our work aspire to be successful. But journalists, success means being read or heard. Most humans pay more attention to bad news than good news. The Wall Street Journal reported that a negative headline increases click-throughs by 2.3%. This leads the entire field of journalism to end up time and time again painting an inaccurate picture of the world, if you will, a darker picture of the world. With that said, in recent years, it has become worse. And of course, I, like many of you, have wondered why. The root of the problem may be the disappearance of local newspapers. It was with them that many of our most significant journalists were first trained to get beyond the headline, trained to ask probing questions, trained to be skeptical in search for the truth, rather than simply reporting both sides of an issue. James Bennett, the New York Times editorial page editor from 2016 to 2020, and the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic for a decade, where Vernon spent some time, has written, "It is so much easier to compromise rather than confront," end quote. The implicit caveat is that this is done to appear balanced. But where is, what I would argue, the obligation on the part of the press to champion the truth? Bennett wrote, and I quote again, "There are many reasons for Trump's ascent, but changes in the American news media played a critical role. Journalists had forfeited what had always been most valuable about their work, their credibility as arbiters of truth and brokers of ideas, which for more than a century, despite all of journalism's flaws and failures, has become a bulwark of how Americans govern themselves," end quote. Many of you have asked, how can you obtain a true picture of events? Classmate and dearest of friends, our own Bill Marimow, has always advised to read broadly. I specifically would recommend reading every day the historian, Professor Heather Cox Richardson, who is published on Substack. What I find is time and time again, she finds echoes of today's stories in history. Because we know how the historical event played out, we are left with remarkable insight into what is happening today. If you desire further insight into the press's behavior, albeit with a significant liberal bias, try reading Robert Hubbell's daily posts, also on Substack. I think I'll stop there for now, Bill.
All right, John, thanks for the imparting all that wisdom and perspective. Vernon, we're ready for you.
Great, thank you, and good evening, everyone. I thought it was interesting that Lev just made reference to a couple of Substack accounts as recommended reading and not the New York Times or NBC News, which says something about sort of the very fragmented nature of our media or our press right now. I'm not sure it even makes sense any longer to talk about the press as an estate or a sort of broad institution. It's so fragmented, and so many players in the press follow rules of their own. Fox News really has no problem with a conservative bias. And I think the New York Times errs in a way because it's very afraid of being accused of having a liberal bias. So those are very different points of departure for, leading media, leading newsrooms. Obviously, we're in a really bad place now in our sort of post-truth world, where politicians running for national office have no problem offering lies as truth and branding truth as fake news. But it's not just malign politicians or even journalists or editors, i.e. human beings anymore, that are part of the problem. It's the social media platform and the algorithm. As Yuval Noah Harari argues in his new book called Nexus, which I highly recommend, we need to ask Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and other owners of social media platforms why it is that we have such sophisticated information technology today, but we can't have a conversation anymore. And it's not just in the United States, it's in every democracy in the world is having the exact same problem. Part of the issue is not related to human beings. It's related to computer algorithms that are programmed not to give you truth, not to give you balance, but to keep you on their platform for as long as they can.
Right.
And to keep you there by feeding you what they know you want, because they watch every move you make. If you want conspiracy theories, they will feed you nonstop conspiracy theories. And this is sort of, the hallmark of the algorithm or AI. AI figured that out on its own. It didn't need human programmers to tell it how to learn how to keep people on the platform, on Facebook or on Twitter. And now they've graduated to producing their own fake news and their own conspiracy theories all by themselves. So I really think that's a big part of how the behavior of people in the post-truth world, where everyone feels absolutely free to make up their own truths, how those voices get amplified in a really toxic way, in a really harmful way. As Bill said, just very quickly, I edit a climate change newsroom now, write about climate change all the time. And climate is beyond fake news, but it's into these very crafty word games and that go even beyond sort of false equivalency, like climate-friendly beef and net zero gasoline and carbon capture and green hydrogen. And it takes a lot of sophistication to figure out what's really going on there. We can talk later about how you need to behave in this environment as a consumer, but climate is one where the oil companies and the fossil fuel industry has become very clever. They're much more clever than just claiming fake news, and they push schemes like advanced recycling and carbon capture, which as solutions to the climate problem. Don't worry about climate. You can keep buying our gasoline and we'll capture all the carbon, and they're really not solutions at all. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, Vernon, thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I consider the anatomy of a false story. And Ellen, this overlaps a little bit with what you said. This involves Aurora, Colorado. When I read that this town of 393,000 people had been overtaken by a Venezuelan terrorist gang, my skepticism prompted me to do some research. And this is what I found, both from reading the mainstream media, but also fact-checking media. And I'm going to recommend one of them to all of you in the course of this. But back on September 25th, former President Trump was speaking in North Carolina. And basically he said, and I'm going to quote him, that a migrant Venezuelan gang possessed, quote, massive machine gun type equipment beyond even military scope, close quotes. Plus he said this, they're taking over apartment buildings. They're taking over real estate, close quote, throughout the city. The gang is called Tren de Aragua. And how did this story originate? Back in May 2023, officials of Aurora, people in the L&I department, tried to force an out-of-state landlord to refurbish 6 apartment buildings that had fallen into deep disrepair. The landlords resisted and did nothing. And then in the summer of 2024, this year, the company called CBZ Management told Aurora they couldn't repair the building because Venezuelan gangs had taken over and management of the buildings had been forced to flee. So it was too dangerous for them to do anything. At the same time, a resident of one of the apartment buildings did a brief video of 4 or 5 people armed with weapons knocking on the door of an apartment. And she wanted to use this as a way to get the police to come to the buildings and enforce the law. This video went viral, and the New York Post, Fox News played it again and again and again. And I believe that that video and the publicity led President Trump to make the assertions that he did. Well, the Aurora mayor is a man named Mike Kaufman. And interestingly and importantly, Mike Kaufman is a Republican. He's a supporter of President Trump. And he felt it was important to debunk this story. He said, quote, "I want to show him," meaning President Trump, "this city. I want to show him that the narrative is not accurate by any stretch of the imagination." Ultimately, the police chief put on a bulletproof vest and went to these apartment buildings, discovered that, lo and behold, there were only squatters there, no one else. The bulletproof vest was not necessary. And the police chief confirmed the following things. Number one, that there'd been no gang takeover whatsoever, not by the Tren de Aragua or anyone else. There are no gangs there collecting rent. And that the police say that in this city of 393,000, they've identified a total of 10 people who may belong to Tren de Aragua. Of those 10, 6 are in prison, 4 at large. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the anatomy of a fake news story. And I think it's important. I got this information. I actually called the police chief and the head of communications in Aurora, but I didn't get a call back. So my sources for this are, number one, the Associated Press, which in my opinion plays things right down the middle. 2, the New York Times, which sent Jonathan Weissman, a reporter that I once hired at the Baltimore Sun, to Aurora, who inspected the buildings, interviewed people on the record, took photos of them, showed the squalor. And last but not least, a fact-checking organization called Snopes, S-N-O-P-E-S. And I would urge all of you out there in the Trinity orbit to take a look at Snopes before the debate tonight, because they quote people, they use credible data, and they're neither liberal or conservative. They've taken Kamala Harris to task. They've taken Tim Gans to get to task, as well as Republicans. So it's important, I think, to find credible sources for fact checking. And before I turn things over to our discussion, I just want to say, John, my quote you gave was incomplete. My mantra is read broadly, read deeply, and above all, read skeptically. So Vernon, why don't you tell us about one of these crafty stories that the Inside Climate News addressed?
Okay. And before I do that, Bill, since you were talking about Aurora, here's where the Springfield story came from about how the Haitian migrants were eating people's pets, dogs and cats. It began on a site called End Wokeness, which is possibly run by the guy who started Pizzagate. Remember Pizzagate in Washington, where Hillary Clinton and other cannibals were killing children in the basement of a pizza parlor?
Yes.
That guy possibly, although not certainly, runs a site called End Wokeness. And the evidence that End Wokeness cited for this story about ducks and pets being eaten by Haitian migrants there was a Facebook post, an anonymous Facebook post, which attributed the story to a neighbor's friend's daughter. So that those are the origins of the story that have been repeated ad nauseum now by Trump and Vance. Yeah, so in climate, you know, if I thought you were going to ask me about false equivalence, and I was going to say,
you'll get that one too, Vernon.
Okay. All right. In terms of some of our stories that we write, we did a whole series on a technology called carbon capture, and to understand a lot of the argument going on in the climate space right now takes a lot of knowledge and understanding. But carbon capture is now being promoted heavily by the fossil fuel industry and funded by the U.S. Congress as a solution to climate change. And indeed it is. It's a technology that captures carbon coming out of industrial plants, and also can just suck it right out of the air. And it's a technology that I think we should invest in and study. But the fossil fuel industry, which has plans to continue selling as much oil as it does now in 50 years, presents this as a major solution to climate change. And a series that we did showed that at its most, if you take all the projections on carbon capture at their most optimistic and project them over the next 10 years, carbon capture would capture way less than 1% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And the climate space is full of supposed solutions like that, which when you really dig into them as reporters, as digging journalists, you find that they really aren't solutions at all. Another is advanced recycling, another is climate-friendly beef, and so on. We spend a lot of our time, it's in the climate space, it's called greenwashing, kind of trying to unwind greenwashing techniques by corporations and industry, which want consumers to believe that their products are green and good for the environment, when in fact they're sort of smoke screens, and they produce very little in the way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Great, thanks, Vernon. Ellen, what are your thoughts after our opening remarks?
I'm going to pick up on Vernon because I think in his description, I think when we think about fairness and balance, fairness means listening to different perspectives and opinions. And I think what you heard from Vernon is interrogating claims regardless of where they come from. In this case, they're coming from people who are promoting climate friendly answers. And he's also interrogating oil companies that may be putting out literature that supposedly comes from think tanks or scientific organizations that are presenting different information. And I think to understand the role of journalists, it is to interrogate, to be fair, but it doesn't always require giving equal weight or time to different sides. And I think that's the really important thing. I don't think Vernon, in every single article that they're doing at Inside Climate, has to give the same amount of time to the original question of, is the climate changing? Are we experiencing it? Like, he can acknowledge, or people can acknowledge, not everybody agrees. But I think it's really important, because I think sometimes it's like, well, you're not being fair, or you're not treating it equally. No, there's fairness when there's really an unsettled question or something that we really don't know if there's a right or wrong answer until we're really able to interrogate it, right? That's warranted. But if you're producing a story about something that, frankly, you may not like how it's settled, but it's settled, then I don't think that you have to give equal weight to those. And I thought Vernon's example was a really good example of something that was still relatively unknown. And thanks to Vernon's reporting, they were able to say, oh, here, we did the reporting on something that's brand new, and here's what we found out.
Bill, I think Ellen and Vernon are spot on. I mean, absolutely right. And it goes to what my criticism of the press has been. Vernon put it well. He said, it's what holds us on the platform. And so where my criticism of the industry is, they're so focused on what holds us on the platform, as opposed to what Vernon's doing is reporting the truth.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Good thoughts, John. This is a question from the audience, and this is one from Barry Sheckley, a classmate of John's and mine. What are your suggestions about debunking false equivalencies in news reports? He said, in their attempts to provide seemingly unbiased coverage, many journalists often present false equivalencies. In a presidential debate, for instance, if one candidate makes one misrepresentation and another makes 30, it seems to be given roughly equal time on television. How do you address that? Vernon, what are your thoughts on that one, given the climate issue?
Well, if you're reading an article and the writer or algorithm, whomever, starts to make the argument that the other side of the climate argument starts to argue against human causes for climate change, you can stop reading. Climate change, the science is settled on climate change. There is no more equivalency with in terms of the debate about the existence of climate change or the causes of climate change. The causes of climate change are well known. They're related to human conduct, and they're primarily related to the burning of fossil fuels. There are other causes, but it's very clear, about the scientific consensus on that point is about 99%. So if you're reading an article and the article starts to quote something at length about how the climate isn't changing and it's climate change has not been caused by human activity, stop reading. It's not an accurate article, and you can move on. In terms of false equivalence more broadly, I like Bill's point. You've got to be a smart consumer of the news now. You've got to read widely. You've got to ask yourself, who am I reading? What news organization do they work for? What university are they affiliated with? Are they affiliated with a reputable institution? Or are they writing for a website you've never heard of? If you've never heard of the site, or this is a site that's popping up in your news feed and you're uncertain about it, be uncertain about it. That's a good way to feel. False equivalence is, it just, I almost think we're beyond false equivalence, Bill, right now. In the post-truth world, where you don't even try to have to answer someone else's argument, you can sort of make up whatever you want. I almost think the notion, the prim and proper notion of false equivalence is like an anachronism. I mean, we're way beyond that. But, it does still pop up a lot. And you just have to be, aware of who you're reading and be a very informed news consumer.
Yeah, I like to say you need to lean into reality. I mean, if somebody makes 18 lies and somebody makes one, that's the facts. I mean, and you have to decide whether or not you're willing to accept that. It was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And, I think when you give equal time to the 18 false statements and the one misstatement, you're not reflecting the reality. And I think that's irresponsible. And I think it's bad journalism.
Ellen, do you think much of the press is doing what you just said?
No, I think much of the press is really trying to, I think, be more grounded in the reality. And I see them in the last, 5 years, I feel like they've been working hard to call things as they see them. That's a lie. That's not true. There's no evidence of that. It doesn't always happen, right? And I think that I think that there is, there are a lot of issues that aren't that clear, where they're still in the process of being debated. I mean, the war in the Middle East, there are very different narratives. They're driven by, different virtues. And that is, that can be confusing to people, for balance and fairness versus false equivalency, in my opinion.
All right. We're going to move on now to some of the questions, both those that were sent in earlier and some of the ones that have been submitted tonight. So this came in from before our program began. I'm finding it hard to trust news sources that I once considered reputable. What news sources can be trusted? What sources can I use to fact check? And how can I detect fake news? I'll give you some thoughts on that. And that is, first of all, I think it's important if you read the New York Times or the Washington Post, also read the Wall Street Journal and read it carefully. Read both the editorials as well as the news. If you watch CNN, watch Fox News. When you do that, you're going to find often two diametrically opposed sets of, I'll say, emphases rather than facts. And then you have to use your good common sense, your experience, the wisdom of history, as John pointed out, to figure out where you think the truth lies. I think some of the fact-checking organizations are really worthwhile. The News Literacy Program has a fact-checking organization. Some people say that Snopes leans left, but in my opinion, I haven't seen that. But I think, and the Associated Press to me seems highly reliable. So I would say again, to read broadly, deeply, and skeptically, and figure out what sources are most trustworthy based on all of your experience. John, since you're the one person who's not a journalist, but a voracious consumer of news, what sources do you trust?
Well, so it's interesting that I do trust the Wall Street Journal factually. I do think it, even in its news, there's a slight bias, not overwhelming, slight bias towards, let's call it, laissez-faire economics as opposed to what government can do. So I think you will see that even in its news. But if you walk in, properly skeptical, I think it does a very good job, not necessarily on its editorial pages, but on its news pages. I was a incredible fan of the New York Times, but am no longer. I think it does things just to hold audience, and so I have a real problem with it. So that's why you heard me talking about some of these articles on Substack. I can't emphasize enough how much I've learned by that, what I didn't know about U.S. history. I can't believe how many things are happening today that happened once before or twice before, and it gives you great insight because you see how it got resolved. So history is a great teacher.
I just want to say one thing, Bill, or two things. One is trust your gut a little bit. If you're having a highly emotional reaction to something you're reading, like take a moment, look for additional sources, as you're sort of trying to figure out, is your reaction emotional because you're upset by it? Is it because you think it's fake? But I find that when people have highly emotional reactions to what they read, I encourage them to slow down and check other sources. The other thing I want to say is I think that we in the media, have had some really bad self-inflicted wounds. And part of that comes from speed, the desire to be first rather than right. And we've seen that over and over again. I don't even need to go through that. And part of it is that we are confusing. We put up panels of people, some are journalists, some are analysts, some are opinion makers, and we get into the business of prognosticating. And I'm a big fan of saying we are not in the prediction business. And I'm always happy to hear journalists give me their analysis, tell me about their experiences, tell me how they, were able to report a story. But I think that we in journalism have done a lot to confuse people about what a journalist does.
Thanks, Ellen. I'm going to take a quick peek at some of the questions that have come in. So excuse me for just 30 seconds.
I wonder too, Ellen, and John and Bill, how discerning readers are when they look at the New York Times website or any website really, about the divide between news coverage and opinion. And it's all sort of up there together. And it's fascinating. There's a sort of progressive furor right now over the New York Times news coverage. The feeling on the left is that the New York Times sort of bores down on the specifics of what Harris is saying and doesn't even sort of cover the
Right.
word salad coming out of Trump's mouth at his rallies. And there's some truth to that. And I think they're less dissatisfied with the New York Times opinion, which really does skew left, and they're not apologetic on the New York Times opinion side about skewing left. But on the news side, they are very wary of being accused of having a liberal bias. So they don't want to have that liberal bias. And I think sometimes that does make them sort of, bear down on a Democrat in the way that they're not
It
right
happened
now.
with Hillary Clinton. I mean, the
Yeah.
scrutiny of the emails
Yeah,
and the
the
equivalency,
emails and the
that
Comey
was
letters and
versus
things. Yeah.
Trump's, history of
Yeah. So
illegal.
even within one news organization, you have to be discerning from one department to another, from one reporter to another. And the New York Times, for example, the investigative reporters tell one very aggressive, tough story about Trump, and the political writers who are sort of covering the horse race tell a much different story. And it's all in the same paper. It's all on the same website. Again, that's part of being a very discerning news reader, I think.
I've got a very interesting question here from Allison Grieb. And this is the question. CBS Sunday Morning did a segment on Finland teaching kids how to spot or at least question fake news, starting with kids as young as elementary school. Could something like that work in the United States? What would it take to have it work here in the United States?
Well, I am proud to report that it exists in the United States. It's in almost every state. It's called the News Literacy Project. And it's a fantastic nonprofit. It has it's nonpartisan. And so it's in places like West Virginia and places like Maryland and Washington, D.C. And really what they're trying to do is empower kids to understand how to interrogate the news sources. And it's the same things that Vernon was saying to you. If you see a headline that promises you to tell something that no one else in the media has, you should look at that with skepticism. If you see a picture that you haven't seen anywhere else, how do you tell if that picture is fake, if it's real, if it's amended? Does that news site have an ethics policy publicly printed, right? Do they have corrections, right? Do they acknowledge that they made mistakes? We all make mistakes, but do they acknowledge those mistakes? Who owns the paper? The person that's written the story, what do you know about their background? Or do they work for a particular kind of think tank? Who else are they writing for? If they're writing for all similar kinds of sites, then maybe they're not a nonpartisan journalist. Maybe they're a journalist that has a particular point of view. So all of this is taught by the News Literacy Project. They're fantastic. Support them. Get them to come to your schools. Sorry, I worked very closely with them. I'm a big believer.
All right, thanks, Ellen. This is an interesting question and a sensitive one. Bill LaPlante, who used to work for ABC News, says, how do you explain ABC News having 90% coverage for Kamala Harris and Walz and 80?
Whoops.
We lost you, Bill. Bill, we've lost you.
Bill, you hit your mute
Bill.
button by accident.
I'm back.
Okay.
Okay.
Could you
So
repeat the question?
This is a question from Bill LaPlante, who was a newsman at ABC News. And he says, how do you explain ABC News having 90% positive coverage for Harris Walz and 89% negative coverage for Trump Vance in recent months? Is that fake news or merely beyond belief bias? What do people think?
I want to know where his statistics came from.
So you're being skeptical.
Well, my two questions are always, how do you know that's true, and how does your source know that's true? So I'm interested that it's hard for me to know what the editorial decision making is in ABC News. So I don't think I have an answer that is going to satisfy them, because I can't explain it if it is true.
Whose percentages are those? Who came to that conclusion?
I don't know the answer to that, Vernon. Maybe Bill LaPlante will give us an answer. But once again, I think it's, for me, I'm skeptical. I don't watch TV news incessantly, but, I do sample Fox and CNN. And I find both of them tilted, I'd say. One conservative, one liberal. So let's see.
I would
Here's
just
another-
volunteer, Bill, that Fox's license originally was not a news license. It was an entertainment license. That's how it has its license.
I didn't know that. Next question, to what extent is talk radio influencing biases and false impressions? Ellen, since you were an NPR executive.
Yeah. To be honest with you, I feel like talk radio was at the birth of narrowcasting back in the 80s, before cable TV, or when cable TV was in its infancy, and it was incredibly influential. I think, if I were to bring it up to 2024, I would say you have to look at YouTube. You have to look at channels on YouTube, which are essentially doing the same thing. They're talk shows, they're popular hosts, and they are highly influential. YouTube is the most viewed social media source. It's incredible. And I think if you're not paying attention to personalities on YouTube, what they're doing and saying, you are really missing the boat on what's happening out there in terms of huge audiences, completely unfettered discussion on every possible topic, highly influential. And I would say probably most influential of people between the ages of 18 and 35 as well.
Interesting. All right.
One huge difference today, Bill, in the news media compared to what it was like 30 or 40 years ago is the fragmenting of sources. And I mean, there used to be, I don't know what the number was, probably 80% of Americans 40 years ago got most of their news from either their local newspapers, many of which don't exist anymore, a national newspaper, perhaps like the New York Times, and 3 television networks, and that was it. And now those networks are greatly diminished. The newspapers are gone. As Ellen said, YouTube is the leading news site. There's TikTok, there's all these social media sites, and the fragmentation is incredible, and the viewpoints are all over the place, and you can go and find the news you want very easily. If you're not a good consumer, you can go down some really dark rabbit holes and read a lot of conspiracy theory and the ugliest stuff. And if that's what you want, you can find endless amounts of it.
This is a request. John, could you repeat the authors on Substack and elsewhere who provide historical perspective for one of our registrants?
Sure. The primary one would be Professor Heather Cox Richardson. All right. The other one I mentioned is his politics are quite left of center. I find him worth reading, but you certainly should read with a filter, is Robert Hubble.
Any others, John?
No, those are the 2 I would name.
Okay. Next question is, what responsibility do journalists and news outlets have regarding fake news? To what extent are we in the news industry responsible ourselves for debunking stories that are phony?
Well, I think first and foremost, we probably shouldn't repeat them. I mean, You know, I think, and going back to the news literacy project, that's one of the things they teach kids, which is so important. Don't share a story if you don't know where it's from and if you don't know it's true. And that to me is one of the most important lessons. Look, I admire the fact checking. I think it's important, it's necessary. I really worry that it is preaching to the converted. You know, when people talk about, I don't trust the news, they trust the news that they're ingesting. They don't trust the other guys. And I don't know that fact checking. So I think it's important. I think it's worthwhile. I think it's better to do it by, you know, inside the article rather than maybe doing it as an aside. But I just worry that the speed and the ferocity of the bad news by you know, it's circled the globe a couple of times before you can actually come on with whether or not it's true or not. I was pretty impressed at the debate, the presidential debate, where ABC News was doing the instant fact checking. I thought that was really cool and really useful, and maybe the best example of how a news organization can act responsibly.
Ellen, I'm sorry, Bill.
Go ahead, John.
Ellen, I think it was the first time I've really seen that done. I mean, it was done very effectively. But I think we should be appalled that it was the first time we've seen it done.
You know, everybody has their opinion about what is the role of the moderators in a debate, right? They chose tonight's debate's completely different. You can go to a website and they're doing it instantaneously. So, and you know that ABC just got totally slammed for it, right? Again, false equivalency. Why were you only fact checking one candidate, not the other? No.
One of my thoughts about reducing fake news in the long term over the years really has to do with what I'll call great editing and journalistic training. I spent a lot of time writing about police violence, alleged civil rights violations by cops, basically police allegedly beating the smithereens out of an innocent person. And doing those stories, I found that the only way to do them and do them well was, number one, try to interview the police. And if you couldn't interview the police, get the records of what the police said happened on the scene. Talk to the alleged victim in person. Talk to independent eyewitnesses if there were any, and make sure you compare their accounts of what happened to the police account and the alleged victim's account. Gather every document you can about their court appearance, and even, if need be, do a polygraph of the alleged victim or the eyewitnesses. When you do that, you have all the accounts, and then you use your experience and your intelligence to come up with what you think is the best version of the truth. But I think if all journalists are taught to look for every account, every possible account of the truth, it will help a great deal in debunking fake news. Unfortunately, journalistic training, not everyone learns to do those things. And a lot of people are hesitant to master what I'll call the other side of the story. But if you do master the other side of the story, it will always inevitably lead to either a stronger story with lots more nuance, or possibly not even doing the story. That you may learn that the person who's the alleged victim had a gun, tried to shoot someone, or something else. But I think so much involves in-depth training and training that's broad and deep. So I think we've almost hit 8 o'clock. So we're going to cease and desist answering questions and maybe just wrap things up with a couple brief comments. And Ellen, since you led off with our opening comments, could you just take 30 seconds or a minute and say what you think?
Well, I think that like students, it's no longer enough to be literate. You do have to be news literate. I would ask yourself, when was the last time you sat down with someone who disagreed with you and tried to engage them in a conversation? And ask them not for the purposes of convincing them, but ask them, what are they reading? And look at their sources together and talk to them and try to understand where they're getting their information from. And because I think the the thing that scares me the most is just that we are demonizing each other. We're assuming that people who have different opinions and different ideas aren't just different, but they're bad people. And to me, I really encourage people, if you haven't had a discussion or met somebody or have anybody in your life who is voting for a different candidate, go try to engage them. You will learn something, no matter what. You will learn something, and it's important.
Thank you, Ellen. Vernon, your thoughts, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like I still feel that journalism properly practiced, as you were preaching, journalism that values balance and depth of reporting, of bearing witness, of going through government records and public records and really searching with an open mind for the truth. That's the road out of the fake news tunnel that we're in. And I think those of us in journalism who believe in those things, you really need to keep at it. I think journalism is one of the most noble forces in our civic life, and I love the word of John Carroll, who both Bill and I worked for, the great editor of the Los Angeles Times and the Baltimore Sun. In a democratic society, there is no mightier sword than the written word. And so I strongly believe in the power of journalism properly exercised, and it sort of pains me to witness, this debate in the post-truth world, and we just need to keep at it and make it clear to people that there is still truth there that's inviolate and that's really worth searching for and striving for.
Thank you, Vernon. John, please.
Well, first off, hats off to you all. I walk away time and time again with great respect for my fellow panelists. You guys are so thoughtful, and it's just marvelous to share the podium with you. I think Ellen is spot on in terms of our trying to engage those with whom we disagree. I've done some reading on it. It's very, very difficult. And the best advice I've seen so far was find an issue where you and whomever you're talking with differ by degree. All right, so for the sake of argument, maybe we're talking about capital gains tax, and one person wants it to be at 28 and one wants it to be 35. At least it's a place we can start talking. So we have to find some entree, and it's not easy. It's very, very difficult.
Thanks, John. One footnote before I close out. Bill LaPlante offered the source of his research. And Bill, we don't know each other, but if you thought we brushed you off, that was unintentional, and we apologize. We just didn't know the source. And Bill said that Rich Noyes, who was a research director that he worked with, had done a study and came to those conclusions. So thank you, Bill. And again, there was no intention to brush you off. My closing thoughts are these. I think the antidote to fake news over the long term is, number one, better training of journalists, better education of news consumers, and broad, deep, skeptical reading. I think, and as Ellen said, listening to people who totally disagree with you with an open mind, questioning them, talking with them, absorbing what they have to say. So I'll leave you with those thoughts: education, training, deep, broad, and skeptical reading. So I'm going to say thank you, everybody. And this was terrific working with all of you again. And thanks to all the well over 100 people registered and participated tonight. And we'll do it again if you ever want us to. So I'm
Thanks,
going to
Bill.
bid you adieu.
Thank you, Bill.